think, as Michael mentioned, that this panel is kind of the longest running show in the Social Scholars Conference and now the Left Forum. We had a version of this panel in April of 2002 with Michael and myself and Lynn and Michael Ratner and Len Weinglass. And we were all struck at that time by the fact that something dramatic had just happened and was happening in this country. That this was not just gotten a little worse, but actually that we were seeing a sea change, you might say, in the way that governance takes place in this society. Some people invoke the Reichstag fire analogy with regard to 9/11, and I remember mentioning that I thought that the period of transition that we were going through right then was somewhat analogous to the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. That is, you were going to keep the formalities of the Roman Senate and having 2 consuls every year and stuff like that, but in reality all power was going to be exercised by the emperor from here on out. And I think that it was a very prescient observation, because I think we've actually seen that come to pass. We still have the elections and we still have the talking in Congress and all of that, but basically power has become overwhelmingly concentrated in the executive branch. And what I wanted to try and go into is like, well, why is that happening? Why now? Why now? And what is behind all of this? And one thing it's important to understand is that all this stuff did not spring from the beady little minds of George Bush and Dick Cheney and Dick Addington. There are actual material underpinnings for it, which is what I want to get into a little bit. It is the product of freedoms and necessities faced by a late imperialist state. And some of the things that actually caused that to move in this way at this time is what I want to look at. In other words, there's always a fundamental necessity for capitalists and a capitalist economy to continue to grow and expand. If it doesn't grow and expand, it gets wiped out by competing capitals. So that general phenomenon is always there. But it gets mediated by, in fact, big things that happen in the world. Wars, competing powers, so all kinds of different things insert themselves into that. And one of the biggest things that happened for the United States is that the whole period of capitalist expansion that was set in motion by the United States victory in World War II, where the United States reorganized the capitalist world, broke down the sterling and franc blocks, created the dollar as interchangeable with gold, whole Bretton Woods agreement that basically put the United States at the command of the international capitalist economy. The huge period of expansion ground to a halt sometime in the early 1970s, and one of the manifestations of it was the OPEC oil crisis. U.S. had to go off of the gold standard, so on. It was something of a major crisis that was followed by a period in the 1980s of a very, very intense competition for world domination with the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union, rather unexpectedly to observers both on the left and the right, collapsed, it created a whole new situation globally for the United States that had both freedoms and new necessities. One of the freedoms that it gave them was the ability to go into the third world and to internationalize production, what we now today call globalization. Was able to go out in an almost unfettered way on a whole global scale. But the other thing that happened is it unleashed and uncoupled Japan, China, and the European Union. China, of course, after the restoration of capitalism in 1976. But these powers that had previously been dependent on the United States for a nuclear umbrella and protection became competitors. And people around the Cheney group in the Defense Department during the first Bush administration actually wrote some position papers on what we needed to do. And basically they said, look, America's time has come. You know, Henry Luce Henry Luce? Yeah. Henry said, you know, the 20th century was going to be the American century. But what these guys said, no, the 21st century is going to be the American century. This is the chance for us to clean up on the whole world. But if we don't do it, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because China is a rising power, the Soviet Union Russia is going to actually reorganize itself, and the European Union is coming together as a competing economic power. We got to move now was their message. And there was a great deal of unhappiness with the Clinton administration for not moving as fast as they thought it should be done. Now, this is the same Bill Clinton, of course, who was bombing the crap out of Yugoslavia and, you know, everything else, but he wasn't making the kind of global power move that they wanted to do. And they saw in this a new American century idea that the real necessity that they had to do was to seize and reorganize the Middle East. Why? Well, they needed to seize and reorganize the Middle East, not for profits for the oil company. I mean, look, we don't have police in order to subsidize the blue cloth industry. You had to have control of the Middle East because that's where the greatest concentration of fossil fuel reserves were, and it basically gave you economic control over the economies of China, Russia, and the European Union. It was a huge geopolitical move to have control not only of the Persian Gulf, but also the Caspian Sea basin. Remember, the U.S. moved into all of those Central Asian republics that got cut loose when the Soviet Union broke up. So you have this incredible power move that was made possible by two things. One, as we've mentioned, is their seizure of power through the 2000 elections. Remember, there is a legislation that decides what happens if the electors are contested for a given state. You know, there's a whole procedure for handling it. It just was totally ignored, and the Republicans instead took the issue to the Supreme Court, where they had a 5-4 majority and shanghaied the whole election. So it was done under the rubric of the legal procedures, but it basically was a seizure of power. And then when 9/11 came along, it provided the pretext to set it all in motion. So what they call today the war on terror is actually a war for empire. It always has been a war from empire from the very beginning. Otherwise, why did they go and attack Iraq that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, as they're all, in fact, forced to admit today? Now, in organizing this, they felt they had to do several things. One is their vision of the new Middle East was to clear out Islamic fundamentalism and organize free market economies in the process of nationalization of the oil that existed in a number of states like Iraq, open those up, to overall their overall global control. In other words, they were to become modern secular neo-colonies. But exercising these new freedoms also created some new necessities for them. You may have noticed that the Iraq War didn't go exactly the way they had planned.